Welcome everyone to Choice Conversations, the podcast dedicated to helping you improve your life, one choice at a time. I'm your host, Chris Stefanik. Let's do this. Hey gang, today I've got a short podcast for you. I'm going to talk about how to have efficient meetings and effective problem solving. Now, as many of you may know, in my day job, I am an IT executive, so I'm often involved in leading meetings. So this is something that I've had to get pretty good at. But if you're not somebody that's in a kind of job where you're in meetings a lot, there's still value in today's show because, like I said, a lot of the stuff I'm going to talk about is just about effective problem solving, period. So, if you're a human, you have problems and you need to find a way to solve them. So stick around, check it out. Not to mention, you don't have to be in like a corporate setting to have meetings. I mean, you can have family meetings, right, to solve problems together collectively. So before I get into that, though, if you have not downloaded my book recommendations, my recommended reading, you can get that at books.choiceconversations.com. It's got the most powerful books, the most influential books that I've come across. Books.choiceconversations.com. There's a link to that in the show notes. Give it a click and check it out. All right, so efficient and effective meetings. I guess first of all, probably the biggest problem people have is that they have too many meetings. They spend too much goddamn time in meetings, right? So if you're in the corporate world, you know what I'm talking about here. So the methodology that I have, not only does it help you to have more efficient meetings, but it also helps you to have less meetings and shorter meetings. How does that work? All right. Well, if someone comes to me and says, Chris, I need to have a meeting with you, especially if it's a subordinate. Now, if it's a client, I might not do this to them, but if it's a subordinate, what I will say is I'm like, okay, before we have this meeting, I want you to answer these questions. The questions are, first of all, what is the problem? Second of all, what is the cause of the problem? Third, what are all the various solutions? What are our options? Fourth, what are the pros and cons of these different options? Fifth, what is our best option? Given the pros and cons, what do you think is the best option? So one of two things happens. You give somebody these questions, and often you never hear from them again because by the time they go through and answer all these questions, they don't need to meet with you. They figured it out. Or they meet with you, but the meeting goes much faster because all of these have been knocked out in the beginning. You sit down and, a lot of times you go over the questions and, you might be done in 10, 15 minutes where otherwise, you were looking at an hour meeting plus. So very, very efficient, effective way to get a problem solved. And like I said, you don't even need a meeting. You could just be going through this process. Even if you're not having a meeting, just you have a problem that needs to be solved, answer these 5 questions and you'll get to the answer. And it's important to do them in this order. So the part where people get really tripped up is when they're doing the part about what are the options and what are the pros and cons of the options. You want to separate those out. So, like I said, if a subordinate comes to me and wants to meet with me, I'll give them these questions. If my boss, I don't say, well, before I'm going to meet with you, boss, you answer these 5 questions. I don't do that, right? I just meet with my boss and typically with a client as well. I don't force them to answer these 5 questions. But when I get in the meeting with them, I will lead them through these 5 questions. If I didn't have them answer them ahead of time, I'll lead them through it. And that's another way to get effectively through it. And I always make sure to separate out the what are our options part from what are the pros and cons of our options. This is just a basic brainstorming principles. If you know anything about brainstorming, one of the things they always say is when you're brainstorming, there are no wrong answers. Don't sit there and be critical of the things that are coming. Just let the options come. Because what happens is if you start evaluating the options at the same time as you're thinking the options, it cuts off the creativity to come up with all the options. It's like it's a different part of your brain, the part that comes up with options, than the part that actually evaluates options. And if you switch to the evaluating options phase, you're turning off the part of your brain that's the like creative, let's come up with options part of your brain. So you want to keep those separate. So that's probably the biggest thing for having effective meetings is that. But in addition to that, another thing you can do is always have agendas for your meetings, right? You know, you want to have an agenda and ask other people that are asking you for a meeting, ask them to provide an agenda. You know, for your own meetings, have your own agenda. For other people asking you to come to a meeting, require them to have an agenda. Now, this is acceptable even if it is your boss asking you or a client to just say, hey, you know, what's the agenda for the meeting going to be? That's perfectly acceptable. And this is another way that you can minimize the amount of time you're spending in meetings. Because if you ask for agenda, sometimes that, just like asking them to answer the 5 questions, you ask them for an agenda, sometimes you never hear back from them again. When they sit there and have to come up with an agenda to meet with you about, they realize they don't really need to meet with you. A lot of times that will happen. And if they do still need to meet with you after they come up with an agenda, the meeting's going to be more efficient because now it's like you know what it is you're supposed to be talking about rather than it being unclear. So the meetings will end up being shorter because they're more targeted and more efficient. And I find this by like having an agenda for myself even, that I end up having less meetings with people holding myself accountable to having an agenda, let alone holding other people accountable to having an agenda. Because like I have a regularly scheduled meeting with my team, for example. I get all my subordinates together and I ask them about this, that, and the other, the things that are important to me at that current time. When I'm putting together the agenda for this, sometimes I'm looking at it and I'm like, you know what? There's no reason for us to meet this week. I don't have a good reason to meet with them. I don't have anything that I really need to ask them about. And so I'll cancel the meeting. So, you know, it's 1 out of every 3 or 4 weeks. Just my normal recurring status update meeting with my team, I cancel it because I look at the agenda and I'm like, yeah, you know, there's really not a reason to do this. So even for yourself, if you make yourself set an agenda, you will end up scheduling less meetings. Now, another piece to keep yourself from spending too much time in meetings is to make meetings short. Start on time and end on time. So those are 3 things. So first of all, if you can, schedule your meeting for half hour. Some people even schedule meetings for like 15, 20 minutes, and it'll force you to be targeted when you come in there if you know that's all the time you have. I typically don't schedule anything for anything less than a half hour, but a lot of times I don't schedule for anything beyond that, you know, where like I know so many people, their default time for a meeting is an hour and sometimes schedule them for 2. I'm sorry, 2 hours is too long to meet. That is too long. Set it for an hour and be focused. You know, set it for a half hour and be focused. If you need another meeting, then schedule another one later. But that's just these, you know, 2 hour meetings is way too long. And for most topics, 1 hour is too long. You don't really need 1 hour. And you'll be surprised if you set your meetings to half hour instead of an hour. You know, if that's your default is an hour, you'll be surprised how much more focused you are and how often you won't need the full hour. So keep meetings short. And then, like I was saying, start on time, end on time. You know, if you keep meetings short, you'll be a lot more incentivized to start on time because you'll need that starting on time in order to get everything done that you need to in that short window. But then end on time as well. Be respectful of others' times. Be respectful of your own time, and keep the meetings short. All right, and there's one last piece to having effective, efficient meetings. And this one is super, super important. Coming out of the meeting, you need to know, it needs to be clear, what are the next actions, who's responsible for them, and by when are they expected to complete them. All 3 of these are very important. I can't tell you how many meetings before I knew this that I would sit in. We'd talk and talk and talk for an hour, 2 hours. And at the end, you wouldn't know what we were supposed to do next. Or if you did know what we were supposed to do next, you didn't know who was doing it. It's like, oh yeah, we need to do X, Y, and Z. And then 2 weeks would go by and nobody would have done anything because nobody was actually named to be responsible for it. Or maybe you do set somebody to be responsible for it, but you don't tell them when you need it by. And then there's wildly different expectations. They have one expectation, you have a different one, and people are pissed off. People are not satisfied. So that might be the most important of all, is coming out of a meeting to make sure you've identified what the next actions are, who's responsible for them and by when. And sometimes the next action is we need to research more. We don't know how to do this project. We don't really know what our next action is. So the next action is figuring out what our next action is. So figure out what those steps are. It's like, I need to call Bob and pick his brain about this. We need to, do some research. That's a totally acceptable next action. Now, I got some of these from the 1 Minute Manager, which I did a book review on earlier. So if this sounds familiar, then you may have listened to me talking about that book, or you may have read that book. Some of this, I think, also comes from getting things done, like the making sure that your meetings, you always have the next action identified, coming out of your meetings, and who's responsible for them and by when. So I did not invent, I don't believe I invented any of this stuff. So I've just pulled it all together and use it. And since I have, my meetings have been shorter, more efficient, more effective, and I'm in less of them. So all of that is really good stuff. And I use it, like I said, not just in my day job, but when I'm just doing general problem solving, be that with figuring out how as a family we're going to solve a problem with my wife and daughter, or just with my friends. What are we going to do when we're hanging out? Any problem, you can use these steps. It will be effective. All right. I hope that was valuable to you. Thank you so much for listening in today. Part of having efficient meetings is having good communication skills and not getting into arguments with people. I do have a guidebook for turning arguments into discussions. That's at arguments.choiceconversations.com. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. I highly recommend you check that out. It's really written more for turning arguments with your significant other into discussions, but the skills within are applicable to anyone in your life, including coworkers and the like. So arguments.choiceconversations.com. Also discussions.choiceconversations.com. Both links go to the same place. Turning arguments into discussions. And again, there's a link in the show notes. All right, folks. Take care of yourself. And remember, make the choice to be great.